What if I told you a $3 bottle of hydrogen peroxide from the grocery store can kill a green pool faster than the $80 algicide the pool store keeps pushing on you? Hydrogen peroxide is one of the most powerful oxidizers you can legally pour into pool water, and it's been sitting on the same shelf as the rubbing alcohol for 50 years. 28 years servicing residential pools, working out of a service truck across 3 different states, and what I can tell you is the pool store guys are well aware of this trick. They just have no margin in telling you. Why would they? A $3 bottle of peroxide doesn't pay the rent on a retail location. A $40 jug of polyquat algicide does. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works, why it works, and the specific conditions where it works better than anything in a chemical aisle. Stick around to the end. There's a 1-minute test you can run with a strip of paper before you even buy the peroxide that tells you whether your pool is a candidate for this fix or whether you need to address something else first. The reason I trust this approach is because my service log shows it on a handful of green pool calls last summer, where the owners were getting quoted thousands for partial drains. Hydrogen peroxide brought the water back in 48 hours. Sample of a few pools across the routes I run, not a controlled trial, but the pattern is consistent enough that it deserves a closer look. Here's what's happening when your pool turns green. Algae are microscopic plants that bloom when there's enough sunlight, enough nitrogen and phosphate in the water, and not enough free chlorine to kill them off. Free chlorine is the active sanitizer in your water, the form that's actively killing organic material. When free chlorine drops below the threshold needed to suppress algae for your stabilizer level, the bloom takes off. Within 12 hours, you've got cloudy water. Within 48 hours, you've got the pale jade color that tells you the algae has won. The standard fix the pool store offers is calcium hypochlorite shock plus a polyquat or copper-based algicide. The shock oxidizes the algae. The algicide is supposed to prevent regrowth. Total cost on a 20,000-gallon pool, roughly $60 to $80 in chemicals, plus another $40 if they upsell you on a clarifier to handle the dead algae floating in the water. That's a $100 fix for a problem that didn't have to cost that much. And it's not even the most aggressive option they'll pitch you at you. If your pool has gone past pale green into dark green or that swampy black green where you can't see the bottom step, the upsell escalates. They'll quote you a partial drain plus refill plus startup chemistry package. That can run anywhere from $400 to $1,500, depending on water rates in your market. Some companies will tell you the only real fix is a full drain and acid wash on the plaster, which was closer to $2,500 to $4,000 conversation. The truth is that 90% of green pools I see on the routes I run can be brought back without draining a single gallon. The chemistry is the answer. The drain is the upsell. Hydrogen peroxide does the same oxidation job through a different chemistry. It's H2O2, 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to 2 oxygen atoms, and when it hits organic material in the water, it releases a free oxygen atom that destroys cell walls. The algae cells rupture, the bloom collapses, the water clears. The grocery store version is 3% concentration, which means 97% of the bottle is water, but you can also find 35% food-grade peroxide online or at certain feed stores and farm supply outlets for about $15 a gallon. The 35% version is the one you actually want for pool use because the math gets reasonable. A 20,000-gallon pool needs roughly a gallon of 35% peroxide to hit shock level oxidation. That's the equivalent of dumping about 12 of the brown bottles from the drugstore into the pool, which works but gets expensive fast. The food-grade gallon is the smarter buy. Quick reminder before I go further. 35% hydrogen peroxide is not the brown bottle stuff. It will burn your skin on contact, and the vapor will hurt your lungs if you stick your face over an open container. Wear nitrile gloves, wear safety glasses, and pour it slowly with the pump running. This is not a chemical you handle the way you handle a bottle of bleach. Treat it the same way you'd treat muriatic acid, which means with respect. Pool equipment also has to be properly bonded to a common grounding grid before you do any work involving the equipment pad, and if you're not comfortable checking your bonding wire, that's a licensed electrician's job. The chemistry side you can handle. The electrical side is not the place to learn on the job. Here's the procedure that works. First, brush every surface of the pool with a stiff pool brush. Walls, floor, steps, the corners where algae loves to hide. Brushing breaks the algae cell walls and exposes the cells to whatever you put in the water next. Skip this step and the peroxide has to fight through a biofilm layer to reach the cells. Biofilm is the slimy protective layer algae and bacteria build around themselves as they colonize a surface. Brush it first, your oxidation gets to the algae directly. Second, drop your free chlorine to as close to zero as you can get it. This is the part that confuses owners. Hydrogen peroxide and chlorine cancel each other out. If you dump peroxide into a pool with 3 ppm of free chlorine, the peroxide neutralizes the chlorine before it ever touches the algae. You have to let the chlorine burn off first, which usually takes a day with the pump off and the cover open to sunlight. Or you can speed it up with sodium thiosulfate, the same dechlorinator they sell for aquariums and well water. About $8 at the home center. Third, with chlorine at or near zero, pour your gallon of 35% peroxide slowly in front of the return jets while the pump is running. The jets distribute it through the water column. Run the pump for at least 8 hours, ideally 12. The peroxide breaks down into water and oxygen over roughly 24 to 48 hours, so the oxidation window is short. Fourth, after 24 to 48 hours, test free chlorine. It should still be at zero. Test for peroxide residual if you have peroxide test strips, which you can pick up at most pool supply houses for about $12 a bottle. If the peroxide is gone and the water is visibly clearer, you're ready for the next step. Everything in this video, and the full 85 technique system behind it, is in the Pool Owner's Bible. 296 pages covering pool chemistry made simple, green water recovery in 48 hours, chlorine and salt system comparisons, equipment troubleshooting that saves you the $200 service call, and the hardware store substitutions that cut your seasonal chemical bill by hundreds of dollars. Plus, a quick reference card you can tape inside your equipment shed so you always know the right move when the water turns. If you are tired of fighting your pool every summer, throwing money at the pool store, and still ending up with green water in July, this is the reference you have been waiting for. Link in the description below, QR code on screen. Fifth, start chlorinating the pool again to bring free chlorine back to your normal target range, which is 1 to 3 ppm on a properly stabilized pool. That's roughly the level where you can faintly smell chlorine standing at the edge of the pool on a calm morning. No more, no less. Run your filter continuously for the next 48 hours to clear out the dead algae cells. Backwash, which means reversing the flow through your filter to flush out trapped debris when the pressure gauge climbs 8 to 10 psi above your normal clean reading. Now, the math. $3 for a gallon of grocery store peroxide is misleading, because you'd need about a dozen of those bottles for a 20,000-gallon pool. The realistic number is $15 to $25 for a gallon of 35% food-grade peroxide, plus $8 for sodium thiosulfate if you use it, plus the chlorine you'd be replacing anyway. Total cost to clear a green pool, roughly $25 to $35 in chemicals. Same's job from a pool service company runs $250 to $500 depending on how bad the bloom is and whether they convince you to partial drain. The pool industry has built a pricing structure on emergency calls. Green pool on a Friday afternoon and they're charging weekend rates. The peroxide treatment skips all of it. Think about that. $25 versus $500. For a chemistry job you can do in your own backyard with 1 gallon of peroxide and a brush you already own. If you've owned the pool for more than a few summers and had even 2 or 3 algae blooms over the years, you've handed the pool industry $1,000 or more for a job that should have cost you $60. Let me address something the pool industry will tell you. They'll say peroxide is too unstable, too dangerous, not approved for pool use, doesn't work as well as a proper algicide. They are partially right and partially wrong. The 3% grocery store version is too weak to do anything useful on a real pool in any reasonable quantity. The 35% version is genuinely powerful and works, but it has to be handled carefully and it is not labeled for pool use in most jurisdictions. That's not because it doesn't work. That's because no chemical company has paid the EPA registration fees to label their hydrogen peroxide as a pool chemical since the patent expired in 1818. There is no profit motive to register it. So technically, you are using an unregistered chemical for the purpose, which is something to know going in. I'll be honest, the first time I tried this I did it wrong. I poured peroxide into a pool that still had 4 ppm of free chlorine because I didn't fully understand the chemistry yet. The peroxide neutralized the chlorine and the algae kept blooming for another 2 days while I scratched my head. Took me an embarrassing number of green pool calls to figure out the chlorine has to come down first or the whole treatment is wasted. The other mistake I made early on was using too much peroxide at once. I figured if a gallon was good, 2 gallons was better. What actually happens is the excess peroxide just breaks down into water and oxygen, and you've spent money on nothing. The chemistry has a ceiling. More doesn't help. If you're getting something out of this, subscribe. We've got more of these coming. There's a regional wrinkle that matters here. In a hot climate like Phoenix or Tucson, where water temperatures push 90 degrees in July, peroxide breaks down faster. The half-life on 35% peroxide in hot pool water is closer to 12 hours than 24. So in desert markets, you want to start the treatment in the evening. Let it work overnight when the water is coolest, and you'll get more oxidation per gallon. In a humid Gulf Coast market like Houston or New Orleans, where the water sits in the low 80s but the air is heavy with organic load from rain and runoff, peroxide works fine, but you may need to run a follow-up dose 48 hours after the first if the algae was particularly stubborn. The chemistry is the same. The execution shifts with the climate. I had a green pool call in Mesa last August where the owner had been quoted $1,200 for a partial drain and acid wash. The pool was an 18,000-gallon plaster pool, about 3 years old, with a salt cell that had been throwing an alarm for 2 weeks. The salt cell is the long, clear-bodied housing in the equipment plumbing that produces chlorine from dissolved salt. Looks like a tube with electrical plates inside. The owner had stopped manually shocking because the salt system was supposed to handle it. The salt system was failing because the cell needed cleaning, and the algae had 8 days to take over. I cleaned the cell, brushed the pool, dropped the chlorine with thiosulfate, and used a gallon of 35% peroxide. Water was clear by Sunday evening, total chemical cost about $32. The owner had been ready to write a 4-figure check. The pool industry knows this works. They just have no margin in telling you. There's one condition where this whole approach falls apart, and you have to hear it. If your pool has black algae, the dark patches that look like ink stains on the plaster, peroxide alone won't get it. Black algae forms a protective shell around its colony, embedded into porous plaster surfaces, and it takes mechanical scraping plus a copper-based algaecide, plus sustained high chlorine over a long period to actually kill. Look, everything I'm walking through here is in the pool owner's Bible. 296 pages. All 85 field-tested techniques, pool chemistry, green water rescue, chlorine and salt systems, equipment diagnostics, plus the hardware store substitutions that cut your seasonal chemistry bill by hundreds of dollars, with a quick reference card for the equipment shed. 3 decades of pool service knowledge in one place. No more pool store guesswork. No more $40 jugs of branded baking soda. No more fighting your pool every summer. Link in the description, QR code on screen. The scraping is the part nobody wants to do. You're getting in the pool with a wire brush and physically attacking the spots. If you've got black algae, peroxide is a partial answer at best, and you're better off either dealing with it the hard way or calling a service company that specializes in plaster restoration. Same caution applies if your pool surface is severely etched, the plaster is over 15 years old and starting to feel like sandpaper. Etched plaster harbors algae spores deep in the surface, and any oxidation treatment is going to keep getting reinfected from the surface itself. At that point, the chemistry won't save the pool. Resurfacing will. The peroxide treatment also doesn't address the underlying cause of the bloom. If your chlorine kept dropping because your cyanuric acid is sitting at 110 ppm and locking up most of your active chlorine, peroxide will clear the current bloom, but the algae will come back in 2 weeks. Cyanuric acid is the stabilizer in your water that protects chlorine from UV breakdown, usually shows up on test strips as CYA. Should sit between 30 and 50 parts per million on a chlorine pool. You have to drain a portion of the water to bring cyanuric acid back into that range, which is roughly the equivalent of 2 of those big white stabilizer tablets, dissolved across a season in an average backyard pool. Otherwise, you're treating the symptom. The same trap that catches owners with overpriced algicide catches them with peroxide too if they don't fix the chemistry that let the algae bloom in the first place. There's also a phosphate angle worth mentioning. Phosphates are nutrients that algae feed on, and they get into pools through runoff, dead leaves, fill water, even some pool chemicals. If your phosphate level is sitting above 500 parts per billion, no amount of peroxide or chlorine is going to keep algae from coming back. You can buy phosphate remover. Lanthanum chloride is the active ingredient for about $25 a bottle. 1 bottle drops phosphates by 50 to 70% in a 20,000-gallon pool. If you've had recurring algae blooms despite normal chlorine levels, test phosphates before you do anything else. That's where the actual problem usually lives. The other place this approach doesn't apply is on saltwater pools where the salt cell is actively producing chlorine. The peroxide will neutralize whatever chlorine the cell generates as fast as it generates it, which means you have to either shut the cell off entirely during treatment or accept that you're going to waste both the peroxide and the salt cell amperage. Most owners just turn the cell off for 72 hours, run the peroxide treatment, then bring the cell back online once the peroxide is broken down. The Hayward Aquarite and Pentair IntelliChlor IC40 both have a simple off switch on the controller. Use it. A note on vinyl liner and fiberglass pools, which a lot of owners forget to think about. The peroxide chemistry works fine on both surfaces. There's no reaction with the liner material or the gel coat. What you do want to watch is calcium hardness on fiberglass pools, since fiberglass runs a lower calcium target than plaster, usually 150 to 250 ppm. Peroxide treatment won't change calcium hardness on its own, but if you're doing this in combination with a partial drain to fix cyanuric acid, your refill water in some markets will spike your calcium. Test it after the refill and adjust accordingly. The other thing on vinyl liner pools is that very low pH plus oxidation can stress old liner seams. If your pool is more than 10 years old on the same liner, keep an eye on pH during the treatment window and bring it back up to 7.4 to 7.6 as soon as the peroxide is cleared. Newer liners shrug it off without issue. Here's the bonus I promised. This is the 1-minute test you can run before you spend $1 on peroxide. You need a phosphate test strip, about $12 a bottle at most pool supply houses, and a basic free chlorine test. Dip the phosphate strip in the water and read the color in 30 seconds. If phosphates are below 300 parts per billion, you're in good shape for peroxide treatment. If they're between 300 and 500, peroxide will work, but you should plan to add phosphate remover after the algae is cleared. If they're above 500, do not waste your money on peroxide. The algae will come back inside of a week. You need to drop the phosphates first. Then test free chlorine. If your chlorine reading is above 1 ppm, you have a chlorine demand problem the peroxide can't solve on its own. If the chlorine is at 0 or near 0 despite you adding chlorine, the algae is consuming it faster than you can replace it, which is the perfect condition for peroxide to take over. That 1-minute test, 2 strips and a 30-second wait, tells you whether you've got a candidate for the cheap fix or whether you need to address something else first. A buddy at the supply house counter in Florida told me he has been recommending this exact phosphate plus chlorine demand test to homeowners for 15 years. About half come back 2 days later thanking him. The other half come back 5 days later with a green pool because they didn't believe him and tried the cheap algicide first. His failure rate on the cheap algicide is around 70% on pools with phosphates above 500. His success rate on peroxide after phosphate reduction is closer to 95%. His number's not mine, and one supply counter is not a controlled study, but it lines up with what I see on my route. A pool owner on the Trouble-Free Pool Forum out of Tampa posted his green pool recovery log last year. 20,000-gallon plaster pool. Salt system, mid-August bloom after a tropical storm dumped 4 inches of rain and overwhelmed his chlorine generation. He ran the exact protocol I just described. Phosphate test came back at 420 parts per billion. He ran lanthanum chloride first, dropped phosphates to 180. Then dropped chlorine with thiosulfate, brushed the pool, ran a gallon of 35% peroxide. Water clear in 36 hours. Total cost, about $58 including the phosphate remover. The service company quote he'd received was 475 plus chemicals. His numbers, his pool, his choice to share them. Single case is not proof. But the pattern matches what I see across the calls I take. My wife asked me once why I bother explaining all this when most pool owners are just going to call the service company next time their pool goes green. She might be right, most of them will. But the ones who actually try it, who run the phosphate test first, who buy the food-grade peroxide and the safety glasses and the thiosulfate and follow the protocol, those are the owners who text me a year later saying they wish they'd known about this 5 algae blooms ago. That's everything you need to know to try this on your own pool. Pick a Saturday morning when you've got the day to run the protocol. Grab your gloves, your safety glasses, your gallon of 35% peroxide, your phosphate test strips, and a brush. The pool owners who know about peroxide don't bring it up at the neighborhood barbecue. Not because it's a secret. Because it sounds too good to be true until you watch a green pool go clear in 48 hours for the cost of 2 large pizzas. But you've watched this far, now you know.